The version of World War II that most people carry in their minds is clean. It has clear sides, clear villains, and a clear moral architecture. There are men who fought for freedom and men who fought for domination. There are liberators and there are monsters. The story ends with the right side winning, the wrong side punished, and the machinery of civilization restored. That version is not entirely wrong, but it leaves out an enormous amount. It leaves out the parts that were documented, filed, archived, and then quietly set aside. It leaves out the decisions made not in rage but in offices, with pens and paper and procedural language. It leaves out the moments when the people who called themselves the good side behaved in ways they preferred not to explain. This script is about those moments. Not the theatrical evil of the war, but the administrative kind. The kind that required no hatred, only routine. World War II was not primarily a war of passion. It was a war of systems. Logistic systems, communication systems, command structures, supply chains, legal frameworks, medical bureaucracies, labor programs, and prisoner management protocols. These systems did not care about ideology. They cared about throughput. And when the throughput happened to involve human lives, the systems processed those lives the same way they processed ammunition and rations and motor fuel. This is what makes the war genuinely difficult to look at directly. Not the screaming parts, the quiet parts. Begin with something that is known but rarely stated plainly. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany killed somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 German civilians. The range is wide because the accounting was never fully completed, and because different governments had different reasons to present different numbers. Dresden in February of 1945 is the most cited example, but it was not an outlier. It was one point in a continuous policy that the British and American air commands called area bombing, or in their internal documents, dehousing. The word dehousing referred to the destruction of civilian residential areas as a strategic objective, not as collateral damage, as the objective itself. The theory was that destroying where workers lived would reduce industrial output more effectively than destroying the factories directly. This theory was contested within the commands themselves. Studies conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey after the war concluded that the policy had not significantly shortened the war and that its effects on German morale had been the opposite of what was intended. The German civilian population became, if anything, more committed to resistance the more their cities were destroyed. The survey's findings were classified for years. The men who designed the bombing strategy were not tried for war crimes. Several of them received promotions. This is the first pattern. A decision is made at an institutional level. The decision results in mass civilian death. The decision is studied afterward and found to have been ineffective even on its own terms. The study is suppressed. The decision-makers are rewarded. The pattern will repeat. Arthur Harris, the commander of RAF Bomber Command, was the primary architect of the British area bombing strategy. He believed, with complete sincerity and total professional commitment, that bombing German cities into rubble would win the war. His men flew tens of thousands of sorties. Tens of thousands of them died doing it. The casualty rate among Bomber Command aircrew was among the highest of any branch of any military in the war. These men were not cowards. They were not careless. They flew into conditions that killed a significant percentage of them on every major operation. And the bombs they dropped killed German children, German grandmothers, German hospital patients, German workers who had no say in the war their government was fighting. This is not a contradiction. It is simply what the policy looked like from both ends. After the war ended, Harris was the only senior commander of his level from any of the major Allied nations who did not receive a peerage. His men did not receive a campaign medal for decades, long after medals had been issued for virtually every other theater of the war. The official silence was not accidental. The government that had ordered the bombing campaign did not want to be publicly associated with it once the photographs of German cities became widely circulated. So they did not commemorate it. They simply moved on. Harris died in 1984, largely unrecognized by the country he had served. His men felt abandoned. The institutional response was to let the silence do its work, move now to a different theater and a different kind of silence. In the Pacific, the Japanese military conducted biological and chemical weapons experiments on live human subjects at a scale that was not fully documented until decades after the war. Unit 731 operated in Manchuria under the command of Shiro Ishii and was responsible for experiments that included deliberate infection with plague, cholera, and typhoid, vivisection without anesthesia, deliberate frostbite experiments in which prisoners were exposed to freezing temperatures until their limbs became gangrenous, pressure chamber experiments designed to find the point at which the human body would rupture, and weapons testing using live subjects as targets. The number of people killed in these experiments is estimated at between 3,000 and 10,000, though some estimates are higher. The victims were predominantly Chinese, Korean, and Russian prisoners, as well as some Allied prisoners of war. When the war ended, American military intelligence units reached Unit 731's former facilities before Soviet forces could. The Americans were interested in the data. Ishii and his senior researchers were offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for the complete transfer of their experimental records to American military possession. The deal was made. Ishii and his team were not tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Their data was transferred to Fort Detrick in Maryland, which was the center of the American biological weapons program. The arrangement was kept classified. When Soviet prosecutors attempted to raise the issue of Unit 731 at the Tokyo Tribunal, American prosecutors blocked the introduction of the relevant evidence. The men who had conducted live experiments on prisoners walked free. Several returned to careers in medicine. Ishii himself died in his bed in 1959. The American reasoning was straightforward. The data had military value. Prosecuting the researchers would require making the data public, which would reveal its existence and its source. Better to have the data and protect the men than to prosecute the men and lose the data. This is not a story about evil triumphing over good. It is a story about institutional interest overriding legal principle at a specific administrative moment. The paperwork for the immunity arrangement exists. It was produced by functioning offices within the United States Occupation Administration. Someone typed it. Someone signed it. Someone filed it. Consider now the treatment of German scientists after the war. Operation Paperclip was the United States program that recruited German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists from the defeated Nazi state and brought them into American government employment. The program was not small. It involved more than 1,600 individuals over its operational life. Many of these individuals had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had used concentration camp labor in their research programs. Some had been directly involved in the development of weapons that killed Allied soldiers. Wernher von Braun, who became the central figure of the American space program and was celebrated publicly as a visionary, had been an SS officer. The V-2 rockets he developed were built at a facility called Mittelwerk, using slave labor from the Dora concentration camp. Approximately 12,000 workers died at Mittelwerk during its operation. The deaths resulted from exhaustion, malnutrition, disease, and deliberate execution. Von Braun visited the facility multiple times. He was aware of the conditions. After the war, his Nazi Party membership and SS rank were removed from his official file. A new file was created describing him as an apolitical technical specialist. He became an American citizen. He became a NASA director. He became a public figure who appeared on television and gave interviews about the future of human civilization. When he died in 1977, he received a letter of condolence from the President of the United States. This was not a secret kept from the public by a small group of conspirators. Operation Paperclip was known within the relevant agencies of the American government. The State Department and the Justice Department raised objections to it on legal and moral grounds. They were overruled by the military. The rationale was strategic. The Soviets were doing the same thing, recruiting German scientists for their own programs. Allowing that recruitment to proceed unopposed would create a scientific and military gap. The practical calculations were made. The moral objections were noted and set aside. The files were altered. The men were hired. The Soviet version of this program was called Operation Osoaviakim and involved the forced deportation of several thousand German scientists and their families to the Soviet Union, where they worked under conditions that were sometimes coercive and sometimes simply professionally constrained. This version of the story is less celebrated in Western accounts, partly because the Soviets were less successful at public relations and partly because the forced element makes it harder to frame as a reasonable strategic decision. But the fundamental transaction was identical. Technical knowledge extracted from a defeated enemy in exchange for protection from accountability. Return now to Europe and to a set of events that were not classified, not hidden, and not unknown to Allied commanders, but which were processed by the institutional machinery of the war as acceptable costs. The liberation of France in 1944 and 1945 was accompanied by widespread sexual violence against French civilian women by Allied soldiers, primarily but not exclusively American troops. The historian Mary Louise Roberts documented this in detail in her book published in 2013. Drawing on records from the American military justice system, French police archives, and contemporary French press accounts. The number of rapes committed by American soldiers in France between 1942 and 1945 has been estimated at approximately 14,000, though this figure is almost certainly an undercount given the barriers to reporting and the inconsistency of record keeping. The military justice system processed these cases with significant racial disparity. Of the soldiers executed by the American military for rape or murder during the war, the large majority were black. White soldiers convicted of the same crimes were far more likely to receive sentences of imprisonment rather than execution, and far more likely to have those sentences commuted. The disparity was documented within the military's own records. It was not the result of individual bias by individual judges, but of a systemic pattern in how charges were filed, how evidence was evaluated, and how sentences were reviewed up the chain of command. The pattern continued in the Pacific Theater and in occupied Germany and Japan after the war ended. In occupied Japan, the American military initially attempted to suppress reporting on sexual violence committed by occupation forces. A press code was established that prohibited Japanese newspapers from publishing accounts of crimes committed by American soldiers. The code was enforced by the Occupation Censorship Office, which reviewed and rejected articles before publication. This censorship apparatus was not secret within Japan, but its existence was not widely reported in the American press. The stories that were suppressed stayed suppressed for decades. Many of the women who experienced this violence never spoke about it publicly. The institutional mechanism that protected the perpetrators was not hatred or conspiracy. It was paperwork and policy, and the ordinary functioning of a censorship bureaucracy doing what censorship bureaucracies do. Consider the specific case of what happened in the immediate aftermath of the German defeat in 1945. The movement of populations across Central and Eastern Europe during and after the war involved violence on a scale that was rarely examined in post-war Western accounts. The expulsion of ethnic Germans from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and other countries was explicitly sanctioned by the Allied powers at the Potsdam Conference in August of 1945. The conference communiqué used the phrase orderly and humane transfer to describe what would happen to these populations. The transfer was neither orderly nor humane. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from their homes in the years between 1944 and 1950. Estimates of deaths during the expulsions range from 500,000 to 2 million, though the upper end of that range is disputed by some historians and accepted by others. The deaths resulted from violence during the expulsions, exposure during forced marches in winter, disease in transit camps, and deliberate killing. The Potsdam decision to approve the expulsions was made by the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Churchill had advocated for population transfer as a solution to the ethnic mixing of Central Europe as early as 1944. The moral justification was that ethnic Germans in these countries had supported or tolerated Nazi occupation, and that their removal would prevent future conflicts by creating ethnically homogeneous states. This logic echoed arguments that had been used by Nazi planners for their own population policies, a parallel that was noted at the time by some observers and then not noted by most others. The expulsions were legal under the framework established at Potsdam. They were sanctioned by the victorious powers. They are rarely discussed in the same conversations as the other mass movements of population that occurred during the war. Moved to a different category of institutional decision. The decision by Allied governments to maintain the naval blockade of Germany into the spring of 1919 after the armistice of November 1918 is technically a First War story, but its effects shaped the Second War in ways that are almost never acknowledged. The blockade, which had been maintained throughout the First War, was continued after the armistice, while the peace negotiations at Versailles proceeded. The German civilian population, which had been experiencing severe food shortages for years, continued to starve during this period. Estimates of German civilian deaths attributable to the blockade during the war and the post-war period range from several 100,000 to over 500,000. The political effects of this starvation on German society, on the rise of extreme nationalism, and on the conditions that made the Nazi movement possible, were documented by contemporaries and by later historians. The men who maintained the blockade were not tried for war crimes. They were diplomats and naval officers doing their institutional jobs within a functioning legal framework. This is not a claim that the First War caused the Second in some simple mechanical sense. But the systems that produced mass civilian death in the First War were not dismantled after it ended. They were modified and redeployed. The bureaucracies learned. The paperwork became more efficient. The next time the systems were used, they processed larger numbers more quickly. Return to the Second War and to a specific decision that was made not by enemies, but by one of the war's central architects of Allied strategy. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed between 2 and 3 million people in British India. The famine occurred within a functioning British administrative system. It was not the result of crop failure alone. Rice production in Bengal in 1943 was lower than normal but not catastrophically so. The famine resulted from a combination of factors that included wartime inflation, a denial policy in which food stocks and boats were deliberately destroyed to prevent their use by a potential Japanese invasion force, export of rice from Bengal to other parts of the empire, refusal to classify the situation as a famine for administrative reasons because the classification would have triggered relief protocols, and the decision by Winston Churchill's war cabinet to prioritize military supply over civilian relief shipments to India. Churchill's personal views on India and on Indians were documented in his private communications and in the accounts of his colleagues. He expressed irritation at the famine as a distraction from the war effort. He questioned why Gandhi had not died yet. He made statements about Indian people that his admirers have spent decades attempting to contextualize, and his critics have spent decades citing as evidence. The famine proceeded. The bureaucratic machinery of empire processed it as a logistics problem and assigned it a lower priority than other logistics problems. The people died in the streets of Calcutta in numbers that were recorded by British administrative officers in regular reports. The reports went up the chain of command. The chain of command processed them and did not change the policy. This is not a story about Churchill's personal character. It is a story about how imperial administrative systems processed the lives of colonized people during wartime. The system had rules. The rules had priorities. The priorities did not include the lives of Bengali peasants at the level that would have required the diversion of shipping to relieve them. The decision was not made in a single moment by a single person. It was the accumulated result of dozens of smaller decisions made by dozens of officials at different levels of the administrative hierarchy. Each decision was procedurally defensible within its own frame. The aggregate result was millions of deaths. Consider now the specific mechanisms by which the Holocaust was administered. It is well documented and needs no dramatic framing. What is less often discussed is the specific role of bureaucratic process in making it possible. The identification of Jewish people in Germany began not with violence but with paperwork. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 established legal definitions. Civil servants applied the definitions. Courts adjudicated disputes about who met them. Tax authorities identified property. Revenue offices processed transfers. Railway companies issued contracts. Construction firms built facilities. Chemical manufacturers supplied materials. Legal teams drafted the contracts. Accountants reconciled the numbers. The process involved hundreds of thousands of ordinary German bureaucrats doing their ordinary bureaucratic jobs. Most of them were not members of the SS. Most of them were not ideological fanatics. Most of them were people who processed paperwork within the system that employed them. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil was not a defense of Adolf Eichmann. It was a description of how organized mass murder becomes possible when it is distributed across enough ordinary administrative functions that no single participant needs to feel responsible for the whole. Eichmann organized train schedules. He attended meetings. He filed reports. He was not a man who killed people with his hands. He was a man who moved people to places where other processes would kill them. His contribution to the Holocaust was primarily logistical. He was good at his job. He believed that being good at his job was his primary obligation. This belief was not unusual. It was entirely normal within the institutional culture of the organizations he served. The German railway system, the Reichsbahn, transported millions of people to concentration camps and extermination facilities as a normal commercial operation. The camps paid the railway a third-class passenger fare for each deportee. The fares were processed through the normal commercial accounting systems of the railway. The railway issued receipts. When the war ended and the accounting records were examined, the systematic nature of the commercial relationship between the railway and the camp system was visible in the documents. The men who processed the invoices in the railway's commercial department were not tried for war crimes. They had processed invoices. That was their job. Move to a different kind of institutional silence. The decision by the Allied governments not to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz-Birkenau has been debated by historians for decades. By 1944, Allied air forces were conducting regular bombing operations within a few dozen miles of the facility. Aerial reconnaissance photographs had identified the camp complex. The photographs showed the gas chambers. Jewish organizations and individuals reached the Allied governments with detailed information about what was happening there and explicit requests that the rail lines be destroyed. The requests were evaluated and declined. The reasons given by the officials who evaluated the requests were procedurally coherent. Bombing rail lines had limited effect because they could be repaired quickly. Diverting bombing resources from strategic targets would reduce the effectiveness of the overall bombing campaign. The most effective way to stop the killing was to win the war as quickly as possible. These arguments were made by officials who were not indifferent to what was happening. They were made within the institutional logic of military resource allocation. Whether the decision was correct on its own military terms remains disputed. What is not disputed is that it was made, that it was documented, and that the documentation was not publicized for many years afterward. Consider the specific experience of Jewish refugees attempting to leave Europe before and during the war. The Evian Conference of 1938, convened by President Roosevelt, brought together representatives of 32 countries to discuss the refugee crisis created by Nazi persecution. The conference produced no significant increase in refugee admission quotas by any of the attending nations. The United States did not increase its immigration quota. Britain did not increase immigration to Palestine. Australia's representative stated that his country had no real racial problem and was not desirous of importing one. The conference is remembered primarily as a demonstration that the democratic world was unwilling to absorb Jewish refugees at a meaningful scale. The consequences of that unwillingness were processed by the systems that remained available to the people who could not leave. The SS St. Louis sailed from Hamburg in May of 1939, carrying over 900 Jewish passengers holding Cuban landing certificates. Cuba refused to honor the certificates. The ship requested permission to land in the United States. The State Department declined. It requested permission to land in Canada. Canada declined. It returned to Europe, where the passengers were distributed among Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and Britain. Of the passengers who were returned to continental Europe, approximately a quarter were killed in the Holocaust. The American Consul General in Havana had advised the State Department that allowing the ship to land would create a precedent that might encourage other refugee ships. The advice was procedurally reasonable within the immigration policy framework of the time. It was acted upon. The ship turned now to the experience of Allied prisoners of war in Japanese captivity and the specific decisions made by Japanese military authorities regarding their treatment. The death rate among Allied prisoners held by Japan was approximately 27%. The death rate among Allied prisoners held by Germany was approximately 4%. The differential is not entirely explained by ideology. It is also explained by the specific content of Japanese military doctrine, which treated surrender as dishonorable and therefore treated prisoners as people who had forfeited their claim to dignity. This doctrine had bureaucratic expression in a 1942 order from the Japanese War Ministry that prisoners were to be made to work, and that the work was to be made as severe as possible. The order was processed through the normal channels of the military command structure. Camp commanders received it. They implemented it. The implementation produced a death rate of more than 1 in 4. The construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, known in the accounts of its survivors as the Death Railway, was a military logistics project. The Japanese military needed a rail connection between Thailand and Burma to supply its forces in the region. The existing sea routes were vulnerable to Allied naval and air power. A rail line through the jungle would solve the logistics problem. The construction was assigned to prisoners of war and to conscripted Asian labor. The labor force was driven at a pace that the project managers knew would produce large numbers of deaths. In periods of accelerated construction, the workers operated in shifts that allowed only a few hours of rest. The food supply was inadequate. Medical care was minimal or absent. The jungle produced malaria, cholera, and dysentery. The project was completed. The railway was built. Approximately 12,000 Allied prisoners died during its construction. The death toll among the Asian laborers, who were less well documented, is estimated at between 80,000 and 100,000. The project manager for the most lethal period of construction was Colonel Yoshitada Imai, who received the Yasukuni Prize for completing the project ahead of schedule. After the war, Imai was tried as a war criminal, convicted, and sentenced. He served 7 years in prison and was released in 1953. The railway he built operated until 1947. Some sections of it were maintained and used for decades afterward. Tourists travel parts of the route today. Consider now something less cinematic and more pervasive. The use of chemical weapons by both sides during the Second War is a chapter that is regularly omitted from standard accounts. Germany maintained large stocks of chemical weapons throughout the war, including nerve agents that had been developed in Germany in the late 1930s and that were unknown to the Allied powers until late in the war. These agents, tabun and sarin, were produced in industrial quantities and loaded into artillery shells and bombs. Germany did not use them in combat on the Western Front, though the reasons why remained debated among historians. Some accounts suggest Hitler was reluctant to use them because he had been gassed in the First War. Some accounts suggest German military planners were uncertain about the Allies' retaliatory capability and feared that use of chemical weapons would bring equivalent retaliation. Some accounts suggest logistical and tactical factors made their use impractical. Whatever the reason, millions of shells and bombs containing nerve agents existed in German warehouses at the end of the war. After the war, they were disposed of, often by dumping them into the Baltic Sea, where they remain today, slowly corroding on the seafloor. The Allied powers were not chemically pure in this regard. Britain maintained large stocks of mustard gas and other blister agents throughout the war, and had plans for their use if Germany initiated chemical warfare. Churchill wrote a memorandum in 1944 raising the possibility of using mustard gas against German cities if Germany used its own chemical weapons or if the military situation became desperate enough. The memorandum was unusual in its directness. Churchill described the bombing of cities with mustard gas as a question entirely of fashion, and that fashion was changing. The memorandum was circulated to the British Chiefs of Staff, who responded with professional military assessments of the feasibility and effectiveness of the proposed strategy. They did not respond with moral objections. The memorandum was not acted upon. The fact that it existed was not publicized. The United States used chemical weapons in the Pacific Theater in a form that is rarely categorized as such. The incendiary bombing campaigns against Japanese cities used napalm, a substance developed by Harvard chemists working under military contract, to create firestorms in densely populated urban areas. The March 1945 firebombing of Tokyo killed an estimated 80 to 100,000 people in a single night. The bombing used tactics specifically developed to maximize fire spread in Japanese cities, where the residential buildings were primarily constructed of wood and paper. The Operations Research Division of the U.S. Army Air Forces had studied the structure of Japanese cities and calculated the optimal bomb loading and targeting patterns to produce the maximum area of fire. The calculation was made. The bombs were loaded accordingly. The results matched the calculations. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the firebombing campaign, stated after the war that if the United States had lost, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He said this matter-of-factly, as an observation about the relationship between outcomes and accountability. He was not tried. He received the Air Medal and the Distinguished Service Medal and became Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and later ran for Vice President of the United States on the ticket of George Wallace in 1968. His campaign distinguished itself from the campaign of the previous administration by advocating more aggressive military policy in Vietnam. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki occupy a special place in the historical memory of the war, precisely because of their novelty and their scale. What is less often discussed is the specific administrative and scientific process by which the decision to use them was made. The Target Committee, which met in Washington and at Los Alamos in the spring of 1945, specified the criteria for target selection with the precision of an engineering project. Targets were to be urban, industrial areas of sufficient size that a single bomb could demonstrate maximum destructive effect. Targets were to have been spared conventional bombing so that the effects of the new weapon could be clearly assessed. The cities that had already been heavily bombed were removed from the target list, not for humanitarian reasons, but because they would not provide a clean measure of the weapon's performance. Kyoto was initially on the target list and was removed at the personal insistence of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had visited it as a tourist before the war and felt an affinity for it. The substitution of Nagasaki for Kyoto was not a strategic calculation. It was the preference of one official who had pleasant memories of a city he had visited. The decision to use the bombs was made by a committee that functioned according to the normal processes of American wartime decision-making. Memoranda were written, meetings were held, options were evaluated. Legal review was not conducted because the weapons were new enough that the existing laws of war did not specifically address them. The scientists at Los Alamos who had built the weapons were not consulted on the decision to use them as a group, though some of them, including James Frank, wrote memoranda arguing for a demonstration on an uninhabited area before use against a city. These memoranda were received, evaluated, and set aside. The process was documented, the documentation existed, the decision proceeded. The immediate effects of the Hiroshima bombing were assessed by American military observers who flew over the city afterward and filed reports. The reports described the destruction in technical and observational terms. They noted the radius of destruction, the condition of structures at various distances from the hypocenter, the behavior of fire in the aftermath. They did not describe the condition of human beings in technical terms because the condition of human beings was not the primary subject of the report. The primary subject of the report was the weapon's performance, moved to another category entirely. The treatment of veterans after the war is a subject that various governments managed with careful institutional attention. The United States government acknowledged psychiatric casualties from the war in its discharge and disability systems in a way that balanced the need to provide benefits against the desire not to publicize the scale of psychological damage the war had produced. The term combat fatigue, which had been used during the war as a procedurally acceptable way of categorizing soldiers who could no longer function, was gradually replaced in post-war medical bureaucracy with diagnoses that were more clinically precise but no less bureaucratically managed. Soldiers who had committed acts during the war that they found difficult to process afterward were generally processed by the discharge and benefit systems without any formal mechanism for addressing what they had done or seen. Men who had bombed cities returned home and took jobs and raised families. Men who had operated prisoner interrogation programs returned home and took jobs and raised families. Men who had served as guards at prisoner of war camps that used forced labor returned home and took jobs and raised families. The institutional machinery had no category for the specific experience of having participated in events that might, in a different legal framework, have constituted war crimes. The machinery processed their discharges and their benefits and moved to the next case. Consider the specific treatment of Black American soldiers returning from the war. They had served in segregated units under a military that treated racial segregation as normal institutional policy. They had fought against a government whose ideology explicitly centered racial hierarchy, while serving a government that maintained racial hierarchy through a different set of administrative mechanisms. They returned to a country where the mechanisms were still functioning. Veterans who attempted to exercise rights they believed their service had earned were sometimes met with violence. A specific case involves Sergeant Isaac Woodard, a Black Army veteran who was beaten by police officers in South Carolina in February of 1946, one day after receiving his discharge. The officers beat him severely enough to destroy his eyesight. The officer responsible was tried in federal court and acquitted by an all-white jury in a trial that lasted 30 minutes. President Truman read about the case and was sufficiently disturbed by it to establish the President's Committee on Civil Rights, which produced a report called To Secure These Rights in 1947. The report documented racial violence and discrimination in systematic terms. It made specific recommendations for federal action. Many of the recommendations were not implemented for years or decades. The administrative processing of Woodard's case was handled by the South Carolina legal system according to its normal procedures. The normal procedures produced the outcome they normally produced: return to Germany and to a different kind of institutional silence. The denazification program, which was intended to remove Nazi Party members from positions of influence in German society, operated for a period after the war through Allied military government and then was handed over to German civilian administration. In the German civilian phase, the program processed millions of cases through a system of tribunals that categorized individuals into one of 5 groups, ranging from major offenders to exonerated. The program processed approximately 3.5 million cases. Of these, approximately 1,600 resulted in actual sentences involving imprisonment or other significant penalties. The rest resulted in fines, probationary restrictions, or full exoneration. The program failed not because of a single catastrophic decision, but because of the accumulated effect of thousands of small decisions made by tribunal members who had practical reasons to process cases toward the less severe end of the spectrum. Germany needed administrators, judges, teachers, doctors, engineers, and civil servants to function. Many of the people who had the relevant skills and experience had been members of the Nazi Party because party membership had been, for a period, essentially a professional requirement in many fields. Prosecuting all of them would have paralyzed the country. so the program processed their cases toward the less severe end of the spectrum. The paperwork was completed. The categories were assigned. The categories assigned did not, in most cases, accurately reflect the history of the individual being categorized. The system was not designed to produce accuracy, it was designed to process cases. Former members of the SS, the Gestapo, and other organizations directly implicated in the administration of the Holocaust and other mass atrocities found their way into German institutions in the post-war period in numbers that were documented only gradually and incompletely. Theodor Oberländer, who had commanded a unit implicated in mass killings in Ukraine, served as a minister in the West German government in the 1950s. Hans Globke, who had written the official legal commentary on the Nuremberg race laws and had participated in the administrative planning of deportations, served as chief of staff to Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of West Germany. His presence in that role was known. It was managed politically. He was not prosecuted. The West German judiciary did not begin seriously prosecuting Nazi war criminals until the late 1950s and the 1960s. And this began partly as a result of the specific efforts of individuals like Fritz Bauer, the Attorney General of Hesse, who worked for years against institutional resistance to bring cases to trial. Bauer was himself a Jewish survivor of the Nazi period who had fled Germany during the war and returned afterward to work in the German legal system. His efforts to prosecute former Nazis were conducted within and often against the institutions of the German legal system, many of whose members had their own reasons for preferring that certain questions not be pressed too firmly. Consider the specific case of the Malmedy massacre, which occurred in December of 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. Members of an SS unit commanded by Joachim Peiper killed approximately 84 American prisoners of war in a field near Malmedy, Belgium. The killings were documented and the perpetrators identified. A war crimes tribunal was convened after the war, and Peiper and others were convicted. Death sentences were handed down. The sentences were then reduced repeatedly in a process that involved allegations that the original confessions had been obtained through coercion, investigations that found the allegations partially but not entirely supported, interventions by American senators who had political reasons to challenge the tribunal's conduct, and ultimately the commutation of all remaining death sentences. Peiper was released from prison in 1956. He moved to France, where he lived until 1976, when his house was burned down by French militants who had identified him. He died in the fire. The men who killed the prisoners at Malmedy were released because the legal and political process that handled their cases produced that result. Examine now the specific treatment of civilians in occupied territories during the war, not in the context of the deliberate programs of genocide, which have been extensively documented, but in the context of the everyday administration of occupied areas. German military administration in occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway varied significantly in severity, but shared certain structural features. Civilian populations were subject to requisitions of food, labor, and property that operated through administrative mechanisms. Resistance activity was met with reprisals that operated through administrative mechanisms. The reprisal policies were specified in military regulations that established ratios of civilian hostages to be executed for each German soldier killed. The ratios were applied. The executions were documented in records that were captured after the war and used in subsequent tribunals. The men who conducted these executions were often not ideological fanatics. They were soldiers following orders that were specified in regulations that had been reviewed and approved by legal officers within the military administrative system. The legal officers had determined that the reprisal policies were consistent with German military law, and, they argued, with the laws of war, as Germany interpreted them. This interpretation was not accepted by Allied military law after the war. Several commanders who implemented reprisal policies were convicted. Several were not, depending on the specific circumstances of their cases and the specific legal arguments made on their behalf. moved to the Eastern Front, where the combination of ideological motivation and institutional efficiency produced destruction at a scale that required both simultaneously. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 was accompanied from its inception by specific orders for the killing of political commissars in the Soviet military, which were prisoners who, under the Geneva Conventions, should have been treated as prisoners of war. The Commissar Order, issued before the invasion began, instructed German forces to kill Soviet political officers immediately upon capture. The order was a deliberate violation of existing laws of war. It was issued through normal military channels. It was implemented with varying degrees of thoroughness by different German units, but was implemented broadly enough to result in tens of thousands of deaths. After the war, the issuance of the Commissar Order was cited as evidence of criminal conspiracy by the prosecution at the Nuremberg trials. The specific experience of Soviet prisoners of war in German captivity is one of the most catastrophic episodes of the entire war in terms of mortality, and one of the least examined in Western historical accounts. Of approximately 5.5 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, approximately 3.5 million died in captivity. The death rate was roughly 60%. The deaths resulted from deliberate starvation, exposure, disease, and execution. The German military administration had a specific policy of reducing the food rations available to Soviet prisoners below the level required for survival, on the grounds that Slavic people required less nutrition than Western Europeans. This policy was not the result of individual cruelty by individual camp commanders. It was articulated in administrative orders and implemented through the supply system. The paperwork specified the ration levels. The supply system delivered what the paperwork specified. The prisoners died in the numbers that the ration levels would predictably produce. The Nuremberg trials after the war established that the treatment of Soviet prisoners was criminal under international law. German commanders responsible for prisoner administration were prosecuted. The trials also established certain precedents regarding command responsibility, the defense of superior orders, and the applicability of international humanitarian law. These precedents were applied selectively in subsequent decades. They were applied to the defeated powers and not to the victorious ones, which is a statement of fact about how international legal institutions function and not a claim about moral equivalence. Consider the specific situation of the Japanese-American internment, which has been more thoroughly examined in American public discourse than many of the events discussed here, but which still tends to be framed in ways that minimize its systemic character. The internment of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals beginning in February of 1942 was authorized by Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt. The order was implemented by the War Relocation Authority, which was a new federal agency created specifically for the purpose. The agency established camps, developed administrative procedures, processed the individuals sent to the camps, and managed their labor, living conditions, and eventual release. The legal challenge to the internment was brought to the Supreme Court in the case of Korematsu versus United States, decided in 1944. The court upheld the constitutionality of the exclusion order. The majority opinion, written by Justice Hugo Black, applied the rational basis standard to military necessity and found that the government's stated military rationale was sufficient. The dissenting justices, including Robert Jackson, wrote opinions arguing that the decision would stand as a dangerous precedent, justifying the exercise of military power over civilian rights in any situation a military commander chose to call an emergency. The majority opinion stood as precedent until 2018, when it was formally overruled in the decision Trump versus Hawaii, though that overruling did not affect the cases of the individuals who had been interned. The War Relocation Authority's files contain the administrative record of the internment in granular detail. Property was inventoried, businesses were catalogued, bank accounts were noted. The people who processed these files were civil servants doing their jobs within the legal framework that the executive and judicial branches of the American government had established. The framework said the internment was legal. The civil servants implemented it. The property of the interned was not returned in full. The economic losses were not compensated at anywhere near the actual value. The formal government apology and symbolic reparations came in 1988, 43 years after the war ended. Return to the Pacific and to a specific episode that is well documented and rarely discussed in American accounts of the war. The Battle of Manila in February and March of 1945 involved intense urban combat between American forces advancing on the city and Japanese forces defending it. The Japanese military, in the course of the battle, conducted systematic massacres of Filipino civilians in Manila. The civilian death toll in Manila during the battle is estimated at between 100,000 and 200,000. Making it one of the most destructive battles in terms of civilian casualties of the entire war in the Pacific. The city itself was largely destroyed. The American military command had to decide how to conduct the battle in a major urban area with a large civilian population. The decision was made to use artillery and air support extensively, which contributed to the destruction of the city and to civilian casualties. General Douglas MacArthur made specific decisions about how the battle was to be conducted and about how the results were to be reported. His press communiques during the battle described the situation in terms that emphasized military progress and did not quantify civilian casualties in ways that would have been politically inconvenient. MacArthur's command had a consistent practice of managing press information to present his operations in the most favorable light. This practice was known within the military and the government. It was managed as a press relations matter and not as an accountability matter. Consider the specific case of the Allied bombing of Monte Cassino in February of 1944. The Abbey of Monte Cassino was a 6th-century Benedictine monastery on a hilltop commanding the valley approaches to Rome. It was one of the oldest and most significant religious and cultural sites in Italy. The question of whether German forces were using it as an observation post was debated before the bombing. After the bombing, it was determined that German forces had not been occupying the abbey itself, though they were using the grounds around it. The bombing destroyed the abbey and did not dislodge the German defensive position. After the bombing, German paratroopers occupied the rubble and created a defensive position that was considerably more effective than the intact abbey would have been because the rubble provided better cover and fields of fire. The decision to bomb was made at a command level that was documented. The intelligence about German use of the abbey was uncertain, and the commanders knew it was uncertain. They made a decision based on uncertain intelligence that resulted in the destruction of a cultural heritage site of international significance and had negative tactical consequences. The commanders were not disciplined for the decision. It was treated as an operational matter in which the available information supported the action taken. This is accurate as a procedural description. It does not describe the abbey before February of 1944 or after. Move to a subject that received some public attention during the war and considerably less afterward. The Allied strategic deception operations, of which Operation Fortitude was the most significant, involved the deliberate manipulation of German intelligence through a network of double agents managed by British intelligence. The operation was extraordinarily successful and contributed significantly to the success of the D-Day landings by convincing German commanders that the main Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The deception was maintained after D-Day by continuing to feed false intelligence to German commanders who believed the Normandy landing was a diversion. The double agents who operated within this network were individuals with complex histories. Some were ideologically opposed to Nazism. Some were primarily motivated by money. Some had complicated national loyalties that reflected the complicated national histories of the countries they came from. Several of them fed information to British intelligence that was used to direct German bombing raids toward targets that the British assessed as acceptable. The German bombers would be redirected away from areas of greater military value and toward areas of lesser military value. This involved making calculations about which British civilian populations were acceptable losses in the interest of the larger deception operation. The calculations were made by people in offices. The offices were in London. The bombs fell where the calculations directed them. Consider the specific situation of Poland during and after the war. Poland had the largest concentration of Jewish population of any country in Europe before the war. It was the site of the majority of the extermination facilities established by Germany. Polish civilian losses during the war, both Jewish and non-Jewish, were catastrophic as a proportion of total pre-war population. Poland entered the war as an ally of Britain and France, with whom it had mutual defense treaties. Britain and France declared war on Germany following the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939. They did not declare war on the Soviet Union, which invaded Poland from the east 17 days later under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland ended the war as a country in which Soviet political and military authority was being established and which would spend the next 4.5 decades under Soviet-dominated government. The Allied powers at Yalta in February of 1945 agreed to arrangements that effectively placed Poland within the Soviet sphere of influence in exchange for Soviet participation in the final phases of the war and in the planned war against Japan. The Polish government in exile in London, which had continued to function throughout the war and which represented the legal continuity of the Polish state, was not adequately represented at Yalta. Churchill recorded his awareness that the arrangement was troubling. He recorded it in documents. The arrangement proceeded. The Katyn massacre, in which Soviet NKVD forces killed approximately 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, police officers, and other members of the Polish educated class in the spring of 1940, was initially attributed by Soviet authorities to German forces. Germany actually discovered the mass graves in 1943 and used them as propaganda, which had the effect of muddying the attribution in Western public discourse, even though Polish and Western intelligence had significant evidence indicating Soviet responsibility relatively early. The British government, which was conducting wartime diplomacy with the Soviet Union, managed the Katyn issue carefully. Documents released after the war indicated that British officials who were privately convinced of Soviet responsibility chose not to press the matter publicly for reasons of diplomatic expedience. The attribution was contested officially until 1990, when the Soviet government formally acknowledged responsibility. By that point, the Soviet Union had 4 months of institutional existence remaining. Consider the specific practice of strategic interrogation that developed during the war. Both the Allied and Axis powers maintained interrogation programs that ranged from the relatively humane to the extreme. The German Luftwaffe maintained an interrogation facility near Frankfurt called Dulag Luft that relied primarily on psychological manipulation, disorientation, and the exploitation of a prisoner's uncertainty about how much information the Germans already had. The facility was considered remarkably effective by its own standards and by the post-war assessment of intelligence professionals. It did not rely primarily on physical torture. Its operators understood that physical torture produced unreliable information and was therefore inefficient. The American and British interrogation programs had similar philosophical underpinnings, at least in their official doctrines. They were supplemented by programs that used less regulated methods. The combined services. Detailed Interrogation Center in Britain processed thousands of German prisoners. Some of the interrogations conducted there went beyond what its own regulations permitted. The documentation of these excesses was incomplete, partly because the excesses were not documented in the same way that the official operations were documented. This is a general characteristic of institutional behavior at the margins of official policy. The official behavior is documented because documentation is part of official procedure. The unofficial behavior is not documented because documentation would create a record. The gap between the documented and the undocumented is not a gap in what happened. It is a gap in what was written down. Move to the specific situation of Japan in the immediate post-war period. The American occupation of Japan, which lasted from 1945 to 1952, involved a significant program of social, political, and economic transformation managed by MacArthur's occupation headquarters. The occupation made fundamental changes to the Japanese constitution, legal system, and political structure. It also made specific decisions about what aspects of Japanese wartime conduct would and would not be subject to legal accountability. The decision regarding Emperor Hirohito was the most significant of these. There was substantial evidence that Hirohito had been involved in the decision-making processes that led to the war, and that he had been aware of, and in some cases sanctioned, actions that constituted war crimes under the standards being applied at the Tokyo Tribunal. The American occupation authorities, advised particularly by Bonner Fellers, who was MacArthur's military secretary, decided that prosecuting Hirohito would destabilize the occupation and risk violent resistance from the Japanese population. The decision was made to preserve the emperor as an institutional symbol, while having him publicly renounce his divine status. The transformation was managed as a political and communications operation. The occupation's goal was a stable Japan that could function as an American ally in the emerging Cold War. The prosecution of Hirohito was assessed as incompatible with that goal. Testimony at the Tokyo Tribunal was managed to support this decision. Witnesses were prepared, statements were drafted. The prosecution was shaped to lead away from the emperor's personal involvement. The process was documented in occupation headquarters files. The files were classified. Some of them remained classified for decades. The Tokyo Tribunal proceeded, convicted 25 defendants, sentenced 7 to death, and concluded with a judgment that established individual criminal responsibility for the planning and conduct of aggressive war, but that did not examine the emperor's role. Consider the specific situation of chemical weapon disposal after the war ended. Germany had produced enormous quantities of chemical warfare agents, including approximately 12,000 tons of the nerve agent tabun and approximately 2,000 tons of sarin. After the German defeat, the Allied powers took possession of these stocks. The decision about what to do with them was made through the normal interagency processes of the occupation administration. The primary disposal method chosen for the maritime portions of the German chemical weapons stockpile was dumping at sea. This was the cheapest and most logistically straightforward option. Approximately 40 to 50,000 tons of German chemical munitions were dumped into the Baltic Sea. Additional quantities were dumped into the North Sea and into other bodies of water. The dumping was done by Allied naval vessels as a routine disposal operation. The environmental consequences of this decision were not seriously studied at the time, because environmental impact assessment was not a standard component of disposal planning in 1945. The consequences were studied later. The corroding munitions on the Baltic Sea floor continue to release chemical agents into the surrounding water. Fishermen have been injured by accidental contact with deteriorating munitions brought up in their nets. The full extent of the contamination has not been mapped. The documentation of where specific quantities were dumped is incomplete, because not all of the disposal operations were carefully logged. The disposal problem created in 1945 by the normal application of the cheapest available disposal method will likely persist for decades or centuries. Consider the specific experience of the Filipino comfort women, who were part of the broader system of sexual slavery operated by the Japanese military across its occupied territories. The system, operated under the administrative term comfort stations, involved the coercion and trafficking of women, primarily from Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and other occupied territories, into sexual slavery for the benefit of Japanese military personnel. The scale of the system is estimated to have involved between 50,000 and 200,000 women, though the uncertainty of the range reflects the difficulty of documenting a system that was administered at a military level with varying degrees of record-keeping. The comfort station system was discussed at the Tokyo Tribunal. It was not prosecuted as a crime. The prosecution chose not to pursue it as a separate charge. The decision was partly legal, reflecting uncertainty about how to categorize the crime within the existing framework of the laws of war, and partly political, reflecting the dynamics of what the occupation administration was trying to accomplish in Japan. The women who had survived the system returned to their home countries, most of which were in the process of being reconstituted under various political arrangements. They lived with what had happened to them in a context in which there was no legal acknowledgement that what had happened to them was a crime and no institutional mechanism for accountability. The first public testimonies by survivors did not come until the early 1990s, when Korean women began to speak publicly about their experience after decades of silence. The Japanese government's response to these testimonies was the subject of diplomatic disputes that continued into the 21st century. Return to the European theater and to a specific set of events in the immediate aftermath of the German defeat. Operation Keelhaul was the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens from Western Allied custody to the Soviet Union between 1944 and 1947. The operation was conducted under the terms of the Yalta Agreement, which committed the Western Allies to returning all Soviet nationals found in their custody to Soviet authorities. The definition of Soviet nationals was interpreted broadly enough to include individuals who had left Russia before the Soviet state existed and who had never held Soviet citizenship, as well as individuals who had legitimate fears of what would happen to them upon return. The individuals forcibly repatriated included former Soviet prisoners of war who had been captured by Germany and who were considered by Soviet law to have been guilty of treason by allowing themselves to be taken prisoner. They included members of the Russian Liberation Army, which had fought under German command. They included Cossack units that had fought under German command. They included civilians who had fled the Soviet Union during the German advance. Upon return to Soviet custody, many of these individuals were processed by the NKVD. Significant numbers were executed immediately. Others were sentenced to the labor camp system. The precise numbers are not fully established because the Soviet administrative records for this period are not fully available, but the aggregate toll is estimated to run into the hundreds of thousands. British forces participated in Operation Keelhaul with varying degrees of willingness at the unit level. Some British officers expressed opposition to forcing individuals into Soviet custody when it was clear they would face execution. Some of these objections were documented. They were processed through the chain of command and overruled. The operation continued. The Yalta Agreement specified what the agreement specified. The British government had made commitments. The commitments were honored. The people were returned. The Soviet administrative system processed them according to its normal procedures. Consider a final category of institutional silence, which concerns the nature of the post-war accounting itself. The international military tribunals at Nuremberg and Tokyo established a set of legal precedents regarding war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace, which was defined as the planning and execution of aggressive war. These precedents were applied to the defeated powers. The victorious powers were not subject to the same framework because the tribunals were constituted and staffed by the victorious powers. This is not a secret. It was acknowledged at the time by some of the legal scholars involved in establishing the tribunals, who noted the tension between the legal principles being articulated and the political reality of who was applying them. The Soviet Union sat in judgment at Nuremberg as a prosecuting power. Soviet forces had committed mass atrocities during the war, including the Katyn massacre, the wartime deportations of entire national groups within the Soviet Union, and the mass killing of prisoners and civilians in the territories through which Soviet forces advanced. These actions were not examined at Nuremberg because the Soviet Union was not on trial at Nuremberg. The United States sat in judgment and prosecuted the German bombing campaigns against Warsaw and Rotterdam as criminal, while simultaneously not accounting for the Allied bombing campaigns against German and Japanese cities. The inconsistency was visible and was commented upon by defense counsel and by legal scholars at the time. The Nuremberg judgment, in its articulation of the principle of individual criminal responsibility for state-directed mass atrocities, was a genuine legal and moral development. The principle it articulated was real. The application of the principle was selective. Selectivity in the application of a principle does not invalidate the principle. It describes the conditions under which the principle operates. The conditions include the distribution of power, the structure of international institutions, the interests of the states that created and staff those institutions, and the practical calculations of the officials who made specific decisions about what would and would not be charged. The men who ran the systems that produced the specific events described in this account returned, most of them, to ordinary lives. They took jobs. They raised families. Some of them wrote memoirs. The memoirs described their experiences in the framings that made sense to them. Some of the framings acknowledged difficulty, some did not. The institutional silence about specific actions was reinforced by the personal silence of the individuals involved, and the personal silence was made easier by the institutional silence and by the passage of time, and by the human capacity to process experiences within frameworks that make continued functioning possible. The war ended. The systems that had administered it were modified and redeployed for the next set of institutional requirements. The Cold War absorbed the personnel and the expertise, and in some cases the specific methods that the Second World War had developed. The bureaucracies continued. The paperwork continued. The specific individuals who had filed specific documents in specific offices during the war became the specific individuals who filed specific documents in specific offices during the peace. The files accumulated. Some of them were opened, some of them were not. The war had ended, and the accounting, such as it was, had been conducted, and the world had moved to its next set of arrangements, with most of the systems that had made the war possible still functioning, still staffed, still producing their outputs, still processing whatever the next thing was that needed to be processed.